Thanks so much, Asha. It's great to be here hosting this conversation. Thanks for inviting me along. I'm really excited to have a chat with these three wonderful humans up on stage, but also to hear from you in the room as well. We're going to be talking from now about 3 o'clock to 4:30, so there's lots that we can explore here, and there's plenty of time to do so. I don't want this to just be a one-way thing, so I look forward to your questions as we go as well. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on, and acknowledge that this land has never been ceded. Pay respects to the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation as well. When we're having conversations about sustainability, about the Anthropocene, about the age of humans as a big group, it's also critical to consider and think about the role of different groups of humans and different cultures, including obviously the oldest living human culture that's still living here today. And to think about lessons we can learn from the past and also how we might be able to work together moving forward. So we have three wonderful speakers up here on the stage. I'll introduce them so you know who you're staring at. You are staring at, from the far side, Dr Sarah CrowEST, a contemporary artist. I'm going to deeply simplify your roles in the world. So Sarah, just for this moment, you're a contemporary artist. I'm sure you're much more than that. Dr Tony Birch, a published author and more. And Dr Lauren Rickards, interdisciplinary researcher and more. This exhibition is called Anthropocene, a simple, long word, a new era in fashion. Before we get into talking about your perspectives on this and the panelists' perspectives on this, I'd love to just give you a chance to stop and think about what the word Anthropocene and this idea means for you. So please take a moment to turn to the person next to you and share with them what Anthropocene means to you, if anything, and how you feel when you hear the word. I'll give you a minute to do that.
So Grace next to me first said, it sounds very scientific. So
Yeah.
Maybe that's kind of where it feels inaccessible as a word to use to describe something.
Yeah, so sometimes a long scientific sounding word can feel a bit inaccessible or exclusive. Grace, do you want to say a little bit more about that one, if you don't mind?
Yeah, I suppose a few of us here from a class that spoke about this word last week, and it was sort of, I get seduced into just like age of the man, and I sort of think about it in that maybe like simplified definition and being a bit scientific, but with not much afterthought or forethought.
Yeah, great, thank you. So the risk of simplicity in a complex situation. Any other thoughts, perspectives?
It's also quite interesting because it's the name of an age, and so you think there'll be an age after. There was ages before, so there'll be ages after. It's just a way of classifying another age, so it's also humbling in that fact.
So there's an assumption there that there's going to be another age afterwards. Of course, there'd have to be someone to name that age afterwards, so it's a matter of whether we survive through this one or not, perhaps. It's a good point, though. Cool. Another one up in the middle, far middle.
Gabby next to me brought up the fact that it's still a contentious issue. It hasn't, as an epoch, it hasn't been officially recognised yet, even though a lot of scientists do say it's a legitimate thing.
Right. And a lot of non-scientists are getting on board and using it and banding it around and making it a thing anyway, whether the scientists agree on that or not. That's a great point.
While we're here, yeah.
Great. Did you have anything else to add to that, Gabby, or is that a perfect representation of your opinion on the matter? Great. Cool. It's always, there's just a psychological note. It's always interesting how much easier it is to share other people's opinions than our own. I'm going to ask the people on the panel who are here as trained professionals to share their opinions to do so right now. Something that Lauren and I were talking about here was that there's a fascination that we both have for the word, but also a sense of concern. And I know that something that you do in your role is to dig into this word and look at what it means and how it gets used in society. And it'd be nice to hear a little bit of your perspective to help us open out this word and its meaning, perhaps to kick off. And maybe just tell people a little bit more about who you are and what you do to lead into that.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, so I'm here in the School of Global, Urban and Social Studies as a critical human geographer. And so my particular focus is on cultural geography, which is the metaphors and language and images that we use to understand the world, and particularly that world we call the environment. And so the Anthropocene is very central to that, and I've been following this debate closely since it first erupted, and even looked into some of its history as well. And I guess it could be summarised as a troubling and also very troubled term. So as Matt indicated, it's now a cultural phenomenon. It's now a social and a politicised phenomenon as well. Meanwhile, the scientists are sort of labouring away, trying to actually do the science on it. And there's a lot of conversations about how to do science in such a politicised context. And it very much resonates with the climate change situation as well there. So it's a new moment between science and society, if you like, in that sense. So I thought I'd just quickly kind of just give you a couple of kind of key questions that are still up in the air about the Anthropocene, just to give you a sense of sort of where it's at. So the first, as I indicated, is kind of, does it exist, or more precisely, what is it? And it might interest you to know that there's actually two really big areas of science that have come together on this, which they consider to be quite radical interdisciplinarity, even though we lump them all together as scientists. And that is the stratigraphers, who very few people knew about until this term came along. But they are the subset of geologists who are in charge of the world's geological timescale, and look at all of these categorisations we have around epochs and eras, etc. And they have very, very precise criteria by which they mark a new epoch. And so they're looking at it through that lens. And in particular, they're looking for what's called a golden spike, which is a global, so globally spatial, temporally synchronous, so at the same time, signal in the geological record, so down in the rocks, to say that something happened. So it's like a kind of line within all of the Earth's geology that indicates something happened. Now that's very, very unusual, and it's particularly unusual to do it when the epoch is continuing. So they're having a lot of trouble with that, just from a purely stratigraphic perspective. Then you've got Earth system science, which sees the whole planet as one single system. And for them, the Anthropocene is the fact that we, as an Earth planetary system, have shifted out of our operating state, and we now operate as what they call a different planet. We're no longer a Holocene planet, we operate as a different planet. And that has all sorts of implications, and it's about the interactions between climate change, biodiversity loss, water system changes, massive levels of terraforming or changing the Earth's concept, etc. So that's a whole area of contestation as well. Then there's the question of when did it start, and there's about 20 different start dates out there. Some are very early, so around hunting and agriculture. And the argument against that is that that implicates everybody. Then there are those that get more towards modern day, so you've got colonial ones, Industrial Revolution, and what's called the Great Acceleration, which is actually the terrible acceleration, around post-World War II, when consumerism and Earth impacts really escalated. So as I indicated, that those dates carry with it a whole lot of political baggage, because the next question is who caused it, who triggered this, and therefore, by implication, who's responsible. So anthro means human, or if you want to look at it more precisely, man. And by labelling this global problem a human problem, there's an implication that we all equally caused it, that we're all equally responsible. And there's a lot of critique of that, to say, well, actually a whole lot of humans have lost their lives and are impacted daily by the same processes that you're now trying to label them as partly responsible for. So there's a whole lot of justice questions there, particularly coming from the field called political ecology. The final thing to flag is the question of so what do we do? And there's two main categories of that question. So the first is the implications around how do we now manage the planet as a system. And I am actually an Earth System Governance Research Fellow, just for the name, because it's so Star Trekky.
Say it one more time.
Earth System Governance Fellow.
It's cool.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I know, this chair sort of feels... So But there's literal discussion around how to govern and manage and direct the planet. And I'm partly in that because I'm very concerned about where that conversation could go. Because if it gets into the hands of a certain subset of people, there's a whole lot of reasons to say this is way too complex for the average punter. We can't indulge in democracy here. We need to take responsibility. We need to take action and, trust us. We're off to Mars. And then the second kind of set of implications to finish off are the conceptual implications and the social and cultural and cognitive and emotional implications, which is where art and design comes in. Because one of the things around this blurring into a single system is that those old ideas of human and nature are actually blurred. Either they're proven to be defunct and always defunct because they're just a Western invention, or else empirically it's to say, well, they're so interspersed, we've got so much plastic and stuff inside us, the earth is now completely ridden with our impacts, there is no empirical distinction. But either way, we need new concepts, and that's where art and design needs to come in, while remaining really rooted in the material basis of this. And so perhaps we'll get to a point where, we talk about where we're situated and we think about the geology on which we're situated. We think about all the honeycomb pipes under us that are connecting us through urban tunnel systems basically to the rest of the world, and start to think in these kind of more volumetric terms as well as horizontal terms through which we normally talk about space. I'll leave it there. It's probably more
Beautiful, thank you. That's such a great introduction to the concept, to some of the contention around the concept, and also the bit of my favourite question, which is so what? Where to from here? I'd like to bring the exhibition into the conversation at this point. I mean, you mentioned a couple of, in your second part of the so what, some of the ideas and the philosophies and the ways of being in the world and seeing the world that might need to shift. And there are works here around us, if you haven't had a chance to look, you will get to afterwards, that incorporate electronic waste into traditional knitting techniques, that explore ideas of disposability, of slowing down to listen, of the impacts of mining on the earth and on our bodies, of forgetting and sacrifice and complacency, and the legacy of the materials that we use and leave behind as well. So lots of those issues are being explored in these works, which is really beautiful. The second last thing you mentioned was about the ethical question of the age of humans and what that means for the diverse groups of humans and the differential sort of contributions that people and cultures have made over time. It feels like a nice moment to bring you into the conversation, Tony. So I know we were talking before and you've got a perspective and have written on that very topic, on the topic of life outside the Anthropocene, and the way that, in your opinion, some scholars, significant scholars, have failed in their pulling together what this idea means and the representation of it.
Yeah, and I think it was Gabby's point, or the point relayed through Gabby's listening partner. I'm taking off here.
These chairs are dangerous, just be careful.
I mean, Gabby's point about what the jury might be still out on, and the geological aspect that you just pointed out so importantly about how that epoch is going to be the golden spike that will say, yes, it's a thing. I'm interested in the other aspect of it, was whether it's a thing or not, the causal relationships to what that thing is, what I'm interested in. So that in relationship to the competing dates for the beginning of the Anthropocene, the ones that I published about most particularly were 1610, which occurs, I think, about 140 years after the conquering, so-called, of the Americas by Europeans. The Industrial Revolution being a major point of argument, and certainly the great acceleration of post-Second World War. Well, if you look at those three events, and that is colonial expansion and genocide, if you look at capitalism under the Industrial Revolution and the spread of consumerism or even nuclear development and testing in the post-World War II period, they are caused by very particular societies, colonial societies, capitalist wealth societies, and militaristic societies. So you're talking about very powerful groups of people imposing changes on the planet to which other people are subject to, and other people in fact become the victims of. So I'm interested in that as a human rights and social justice issue in part, And secondly, the notion about, and again, this is not to demean that notion that the Anthropocene indicates the extent to which humans have impacted on the planet, that in fact itself is not a new idea. So that, again, while the Anthropocenic notion is a particular scientific venture, a really good practical example of this would be, and I don't want to go into detail, we don't have time, but last week when we were at the Water Futures Conference, I talked about particular Aboriginal stories of future and what they indicated. Now, one of the things that we know that when Europeans first arrived in Aboriginal country, both here in what became Victoria and in what became New South Wales, one of the first things that troubled Indigenous communities was the excessive use of smoke in a relative sense. If you look at the economy of fire, and here I'm not talking about fire stick technology, the use of daily fire to warm, to heat, to cook. Indigenous communities use very economical fire, small fires, basically. And to see the excessive use of fire as a technology and the amount of smoke in the atmosphere, even at that simple level, Indigenous people were saying this is not good for air, it's not good, etc., for many things. So what I've been underwhelmed by, I suppose, is when I've listened particularly to humanities scholars, and not all, there's some great feminist critique of the Anthropocene and some really great, what I would call, human rights critique of the Anthropocene. Slow Violence, the Rob Nixon book, is a classic book that I really enjoy, is that a lot of the discussion that I've read is devoid of that notion of what I would consider responsibility. And I know it's a bit of a cliche, but that common humanity, we're all in this together, we've got to get out of this together, not recognising not only past inequities, but the inequities we live with today. That there are people in the community, when you think of relative power, who are powerless to make change, who are powerless to even have a conversation, whereas other people are in a very, we're in a relative sense in a much more powerful state than the people I was talking to Matt about. I'm working with a group of older people in the western suburbs this morning on climate. They feel most of all completely disempowered. They feel they have no voice, and they're worried because they don't feel there's anything they can do to get someone to listen to their concerns about country.
So there's a risk that you can see, is this right, that when we start to talk about the Anthropocene and this being the age of all humans, that we say, well, that's all humans and that we all need to get on with solving the thing now, and we lose sight of conversations about identity politics and about the responsibility of those who have contributed more to this thing.
Yes, and I mean, I don't want to be a hypocrite because I think ultimately we do need to cooperate. So if we're going to get out of this, it will require a lot of cooperation. The point there would be that sometimes that cooperative relationships are strategic relationships. So again, it's not about us all having a lifetime platonic love-in around the climate. So it might be the fact that, there's really strong alliances now being formed between local Indigenous communities and environmentalists that were more problematic in the past, but there are really good projects happening where, for strategic and reasons of equal value, that Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people are working very effectively on. So I think those strategic relationships are important. In regard to, I don't want to hit that negative hot button around identity politics, but we all may have particular communities that we have a very strong alliance to, where our primary objective as activists or as people, it's where our energy goes. But in regard to an issue like global climate change, again, I think we need to think about strategic relationships that are cross-cultural, cross-political, that certainly would advantage each of us. And the last thing I'd say on that is, my other point, and I suppose it's the main thing I do, is to give proper authority and value to Indigenous knowledge and find ways where that can be an equitable partnership. So that in one of my recent articles, I actually have written about a couple of particular non-Aboriginal scholars who have worked with Indigenous communities for decades now, who I think their learning and their reasoning around what we can do is invaluable for people to think of a way forward. So in that sense, I'm trying to think optimistically about how we can find ways to set up cooperative partnerships and structures that don't necessarily have to become homogenised.
Yes, yes. Beautiful. I mean, in addition to Tony being a published author and researching Indigenous knowledge systems at Victoria University at the moment, I'm also interested in the way creative practices contribute to our understanding of climate change and such issues. I want to move into that space, so talking about not just this idea of the Anthropocene and then one of the elements of that, which is climate change, but of the creative practices and creative efforts and work and the way they can contribute to our understanding of and processing of and dealing with an idea like this of the Anthropocene and a set of issues like this. So I want to bring Sarah, I want to bring you into the conversation here. As a contemporary artist, it'd be nice to hear a little bit about the work you do, and particularly maybe to tell the general with the specific, there's a work, the mound activity that you've been working on that would be nice to hear about, and perhaps how that pertains to the stuff that we're talking about here.
Okay. It's quite funny that I sat on the end. I'm the kind of introverted artist, and it's like my view is perhaps a lot more personal. When I think about the Anthropocene, on the one hand, there's a sort of bigger picture where I think about, the kind of horror of what's happening to our Earth, but then I draw some comfort from thinking about this deep time, or this vast geological time that's being kind of, I guess, used in that name is being used for. And then there's the more personal feeling about it, which involves my own anxieties about, the unstoppable forces of capitalism and the kind of havoc that's been wreaked on our planet. Mound activity is a project that I've probably started maybe 10, 12 years ago. It's a thing that I dip in and out of, but it began as a response to, this overwhelming ethical burden that I was feeling about, as a human being, and what we were all part of. And I'd lobbed into Melbourne, and I began my PhD at the VCA, and I was just astonished by the amount of art waste and, leftover kind of paint and styrofoam and all sorts of things that were just continually dumped into the bins. And I just started gathering this stuff up and agglomerating it into these kind of lumps and covering them with skins and crusts and kind of creating these mounds and rock-like forms. I actually felt like... Has anyone seen the Spirited Away? It's Miyazaki's film. Yeah, probably most of you have. But there's a sort of brown, gloopy, mound-like creature in that, which I thought was a river monster who was just, like me, just absorbing all this excess sort of garbage. But I just had a little look. I read up about it, and it's actually it's called the stink spirit, and he first appears, in this sort of disgusting, grimy, sludge-infested state, and then they pull out all the truckloads of human waste, the sort of stuff that gets thrown into rivers, that kind of debris, and then he's revealed as the unnamed river spirit, actually. Who becomes someone very generous and wise. Anyway, I didn't know that last bit about, but I had this feeling of myself as just absorbing all this junk, and it was like I kind of taken this what I call the ethical burden, this kind of weight upon myself almost as an individual. And I won't go into detail, but those forms have been used in many ways since then. So it's a sort of ongoing art project that's quite context specific at different times. They have variously become objects for performance and sort of activities like, almost Sisyphus-like rolling of a ball up a hill and rolling back, and, shrine-like objects. I got very excited when I went to India and how some rock protuberances from the earth became sort of deified, and it was like a thing that almost anybody could choose to make a shrine to anything that they felt they needed to. And I really like that open kind of spiritual, realistic. I guess it's like religion, but it seemed much more open and less prescribed than anything that I'd been exposed to throughout my childhood, which was, I guess, Christianity of the Protestant kind. Yeah, it's been many more things. I don't know. I just don't want to ramble on about that. You might want to ask some questions.
But it's as a response to your feeling of challenge, it sounds like, of how do I keep, as an artist, making work given this context, given that I'm living in this time, and I can see that I'm guessing, but following my heart's passion to create something I want to create in the world, but I'm seeing it having this effect of waste, of material use and things like that, contribution to climate change.
Part, of the response. This thing as an artist. I love making things, but there's this feeling of, especially within contemporary art, I think a lot of artists get things fabricated, if they're working on a larger scale, and the sort of material waste seems quite absurd, because there's only a very small proportion of that actually gets kind of collected and taken up as part of the canon. There's just millions of artists all over the world making, all kinds of things that never really go anywhere except into the skip. So it was... Beautiful
trash, though. Beautiful trash. I mean, you've got me thinking about a couple of ideas that are mentioned by one of the artists in his artist statement about his work. John Brooks talks about guilt and the feeling of guilt of living through a time like this. But then also, I guess you're talking about potentially the guilt of being an artist at a time like this. The other idea that he brought into his notes about his work was arrogance, which I thought was interesting. Sometimes I've wondered if the Anthropocene as an idea is quite arrogant in itself. It's more a question than a statement, but geological epochs tend to be very, very, very vast periods of time. The Holocene's sort of the short one at 12,000 years. The Pleistocene, 1.8 million years, and lots of long epochs before that. This one at best has been, a couple of hundred years so far. It seems slightly premature potentially to even bother going for whether it's a thing, whether we need to name it as an epoch. And that if it's over in 100 or 200 years, which is one of the possibilities on the table if we don't get our shit sorted out, then that was the shortest bloody epoch in the history of everything. And it's a little bit ridiculous potentially to name it as a thing like an epoch, when it was actually, maybe it wasn't a golden spike, it was some sort of other spike. I'd just be interested in your reflection on that, if anyone on the panel has a thought on that.
Well, I'll have a go just to kick off. Some of the resistance against the concept is very much of that nature.
Is everyone okay? Yep, good.
And in that sense, it reflects some of the different resistance that the anthropogenic climate change message gets as well, which is a kind of, oh, come on, little old us against the big planet. But one of the things that Earth system science points to is non-linear change, which is catalytic change, where small things can have big effects. So there's that, plus the fact that actually as a collective group with technology, remember it's not just us and our little bodies, it's all the systems and infrastructures that were created that extend far out into space. They talk about the intergalactic Anthropocene now too as well. It's not just the Earth we're changing just all the satellite debris and stuff. So I think it's kind of it's a natural enough response, but I think it's also a little bit incongruous with what's going on. What I would say is more arrogant is the attempts by certain groups, such as the Breakthrough Institute in California, who's an eco-modernist think tank, which is a kind of techno-utopian vision of the world, to say all this doom and gloom of the Anthropocene is really misreading it. We need to see the Anthropocene as good, if not great. And in actual fact, we are the God species. Man is now God. God is dead, nature's dead. All that there is us, and we should embrace that and celebrate us. And the man bit is very much deliberate. And that to me is like sci-fi kind of gone crazy. But that's the sense that there's more energy than we know what to do with. We should triple energy demand. We should just link up plant photosynthesis with computer technology and basically our brains, and it all becomes very, very techno-utopian. And that's the arrogance to think that we can't be limited, this refusal to be limited.
And potentially coming from a place of deep privilege as well, that
huge
sort of conversation.
Privilege, huge privilege.
Tony?
I mean, it's interesting that I've only just been sent a paper, which I haven't read, but a friend of mine, Stephen Muki, sent me, and this is an idea which is gathering force, and I suppose someone like Donald Trump gets you thinking about many things, but one is the sort of the hard right and the sort of neocon capitalist agenda actually will move to a point where it will stop talking about climate change as a myth, and it will start talking about, or thinking about at least, how do we discard those who will be most affected and protect ourselves, which is a really divisive possibility. And certainly, while I thinking about all in the same boat, in the short term, that the more money you have, the sort of protection you'll be able to garner around yourself will be real for a certain time. You've only got to look at what happened in New Orleans through Hurricane Katrina to understand what happens in the aftermath of a dramatic weather event and who gets affected. But one of the things that you do raise about arrogance, which might seem oblique, but one of the things that I've only been working specifically in this area for 2 years, and what it has taught me personally, is the need to be actually more humble. And for me, the need to talk less and listen more. So I have a background in academic history and activism, and pretty fiery activist when I need to be. And I've actually found that this process has taught me more because of disempowered groups who we need to consider. We need to listen to a lot more voices, and we need to practice humility, I mean in a real sense, so that while I'm happy to talk with this group, I don't see my role as being I don't want to be a spokesperson on the Anthropocene. I want to immerse myself with groups of people who practice that ability to connect and to do something. So for me, it's been more of a humbling exercise, and partly, as I spoke about earlier, why I was disappointed when I looked at some really big humanities scholars. It seems to me the worst time in sort of intellectual institutions to be performative, to be more grounded and feel connected with people rather than do the, as I called it to Matt before, there are these whole group of what I call FIFO academics, fly in, fly out all over the globe, and they do these big gigs, and they're gods. And their disconnect is, to me, has become more worrying.
So there's so much great stuff we can dig into here. Questions of power and responsibility, questions about this term and how concrete it is and what it means and how to respond to it, and whether there are some really troubling ways that people are responding to it already, and what to do about that. Particularly for today, for this conversation, I'm interested in the role of the creative industries in responding to this idea of the Anthropocene, and interested in your perspectives and thoughts on that. From my point of view, I didn't mention before where I'm coming from being in this conversation. So I'm a musician myself and a facilitator, which I'm doing now live. And I work with a lot of arts organisations around questions of sustainability and climate change. I help run a small organisation called Tipping Point Australia, which is actively wanting to start and have these conversations about climate, sustainability in the arts, and until recently was on the board of Next Wave Festival as well, having conversations there about sustainability and inclusivity and how all those things weave together with the arts. So this is very much a space that I care a lot about myself, and I know people on this panel and in this room do. And I want to take this conversation and where we've got to now with some perhaps shared understanding of the idea and some of the issues around it. And what does all that mean then for the creative industries? So I guess it's a little bit of a so what question, but with a particular tone to it, a particular focus. I'd love to just hand back over to you as a group to chat with the person next to you for a minute about that question. What does this all mean for the creative industries? That might be a personal question. What does it mean for you and your creative practice if you're an artist or someone working in the arts? Or what do you think it means for the creative industries and creative work, full stop? have a bit of a chat, and then we'll come back for some Q&A with the panellists on that topic. Anyone have any thoughts, inspirations?
I guess in the sense of like this whole topic in the creative space especially is the idea of responsibility, and not just responsibility in terms of adding waste, but also our ability and responsibility to help create awareness of the idea and what we can add on like a social aspect, I guess. So I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that.
Yeah, has anyone got a perspective on that?
Yeah.
Sarah?
I guess I've got to hold this correctly, yeah. I did make a few notes about, where I thought things might be going in contemporary art, and I've got a few exhibitions that I think extend upon what's gone on here that I could describe at maybe at another point. But it occurred to me that there's a lot of really fantastic and provocative ideas in this exhibition, but I always worry within the arts that we're kind of preaching to the converted, or the people that come and look and explore already perhaps have this kind of awareness going on. And it's not just a criticism of this exhibition. I have that criticism towards my own art practice constantly, I feel that, and to the broader kind of visual arts, whole sort of gallery system generally. It's like the people that go and look, they're already pretty much, aware of the concerns that we have. And I think one of the things that we need to think more about is that how we can get these ideas and this kind of awareness out into the wider community. And, I often think sort of collaboration with more activist-oriented people is a good idea, where we can bring our creativity to other kinds of events, and protests might be one way of doing it. But yeah, I'd be interested if anybody else has ideas in that direction, because we are often in a bit of a bubble in not only the art world but also the kind of university and our institutions. We're kind of interested in making the world a better place on the whole.
Great perspective. Tony?
I'm interested in that from the perspective of someone who I'm not an artist, going to galleries, and I'm a novelist and a short fiction writer, and I taught writing at Melbourne University for about 13 years. And the first class, I still ask students, what's your one-sentence ethical statement that guides you as a writer? And no student had one, but that's okay, I wouldn't expect it, but it was to provoke us to think about that. So the issue of responsibility at a general level, my feeling is, I think that thinking about producing work, what responsibility or statement of responsibility will be ascribed to it. And to me, it would be wrong not to have one, just as a general principle. But to take up the question, and I agree wholeheartedly, except I always wonder about what I think about is, and maybe I'm trying to be optimistic, about the sort of invisible knock-on effect of something that you witness. So that one of my favourite filmmakers, Ivan Sen, one of his early films called Dust, which was a short film he made while he was a student. When I see artwork that really has an impact on me, it's like a pause and then a connect. So I'll see something and it's like getting a writing idea, I connect with it, and it won't go away. It has to be engaged with. And I'll usually write something about it. And with Sen's work, I wrote several academic articles. We showed his work at a film festival where I talked about that film in particular. And it is interesting that years later, people come back to me having been at that screening or having read that work and not seen the film, that ripple effect is greater than we think. So at one level, the converted, I'm one of the very converted, so I agree. And I wonder, as people who go to galleries, as much as we talk about engagement with activists as artists, I think as someone engaging with your creative practice and being impacted on by it, then I feel that energy effect is something that I need to then pass on. Yep. And in other words, so I see I'm a responsibility as a gallery visitor. Now I know not everyone does that, but I think there are impacts on work that we will never witness, but it does have a life out there. But whether it has a life as much as just sitting on a barricade and stopping a coal truck from getting into the city, I don't know.
I guess I was sort of thinking more about bringing our creativity as artists to those kind of occasions. And I kind of think of the demonstrations that have been held in the US, particularly the big women's march recently. And I saw this banner someone had written, and it was, something like Donald Trump making protests great again. And it's like there was so much incredible creativity in the slogans and banners of that march that I haven't sort of seen since the 1970s back in London, when protesting was quite an impactful thing. I think it's sort of become less in terms of those kind of marches anyway. I think the kind of activism where they actually do barricade or obstruct things are a bit more sort of effective. But yeah, just in a creative sense, I think, there's lots of quite visually provocative things and that people could bring.
It sounds like those two
out of the gallery.
Things that you're talking about don't need to be mutually exclusive either.
Well, it's interesting listening to you talk again. It's where those two issues have morphed in the sovereignty exhibition at ACCA.
Oh, absolutely.
So I did a catalogue essay for that exhibition, and some of it is bringing work into the space that began as part of the Shutdown Melbourne protests, and some of it, the historical material, is looking at activism from the 70s that came again out of events like the 10 Embassy, of which art practice came out of, and that went back. The other thing there, I suppose, which would be interesting, to go back to your question, and I think also yours, is that the generational education of that within the Aboriginal community has been remarkable. Now, I know it's different in mainstream community, but within the Aboriginal community, both the education through art practice is as important as education through intellectual practice. It is seen as having that very strong influence. So, to put it simply, I think art is valued as a political idea in the Aboriginal community centrally. It's given central place.
Yeah, beautiful. Interestingly, I think community organisers and environmental groups and so on are starting to get a sense of the potential of the arts for the work that they're doing. I know the latest large climate rally here in Australia, in Melbourne, the Australian Conservation Foundation and some other environment groups got a bunch of artists to come in and have conversations in the early stages about what that might look like for that event. And not just for banners and placards, but for the design of the thing, what it feels like as you go, what moments to create as sort of experienced designers, effectively, to help create a meaningful, deep experience for participants. Interested in other thoughts or questions from the room?
It's interesting what you said about, the beauty and artistry of the placards and the signs. And I was just thinking the other day, I'm from the States, and it's been like a very emotional and wild ride to watch a lot of these protests from here. And a friend of mine did a beautiful piece in response to the Standing Rock protests that meant so much to me, because it was like everything there had been so violently destroyed. And to call in the power and privilege that artists have to put art in a safe space that won't be destroyed by police is such a fantastic and important thing. So I think that's something that we can definitely think about as artists, of like, how can we use our privilege to put things in some space that they won't just be like absolutely ravaged, and like, the amount of power we have there is so different than people who are, like out in Dakota and getting knocked around, and it meant a lot to me to see that done.
Yeah, it's a really good comment.
Lauren, I know you had some reflections in the break when everyone was chatting about what this means for creative industries and creative work. You had some thoughts. It'd be nice to hear those at this point.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking about this more from the perspective of materiality. So one of the things about the Anthropocene is that it stretches and challenges our concepts, but it also stretches the notion or the separation between concept and materiality. So materiality has to be part of what we're thinking about when we're thinking about the creative industries. And
what do you mean by materiality?
So this is around the physical being and the physical realities at multiple scales of our every moment of existence. So when we think about waste, and I just love that image of you collecting all that waste in the VCA, and to stretch our concept of waste. So when we think about the waste that we're generating, think about, you know, the embodied energy, the embodied carbon, and the way that what we're wearing is connected to the great scars in the landscape in distant locations. It's to do with the blackening of the Arctic ice and the melting of the ice caps there. The way that all of the globalised systems that we're part of mean that the waste goes far beyond the plastic packaging that something comes in. Because sometimes that waste conversation is so domesticated. It's like, yeah, there's my bin and that's my waste for the week. You know, I've counted it and I've weighed it. It's like, that's good, but I'm sorry, but your waste is scattered around the planet. So when you think about the creative industries, focusing on that industry element is really key. And I think there's actually just a really profound conversation to be had around sufficiency, around how much stuff do we need to make, following the thing from start to grave, you know, cradle to grave. I love the way the recycling has become part of this exhibition and that reusing, but you know, how do we make that beyond the kind of Hessian bag hippie thing? How does that become part of the concepts, the big picture type stuff? And the other concept I just wanted to bring into this is that some people's responses at the community level around the Anthropocene has been what's called prefigurative politics, which is to say, let's just be and act and practice the future that we want to have. Other people are not going to create it for us. We have to do the big collective conversations and the mottos and the slogans and change global consciousness. But we also can't put our lives on hold and keep living as if everything's going normally while doing that and waiting for some kind of feedback loop to give us the green light. Now's the time to change. So there are people out there making and practicing life as they want it to be. So one sort of fairly imperfect but well-known example of this is transition towns, of just creating whole towns and communities on the basis of a very broadly defined concept of social ecological resilience and living even kind of their own currencies. So I guess I'm just trying to encourage you to kind of think big and do all of that and have the ideas, but to also just start now. Start in RMIT. My God, the university needs it. Just think of all the other conversations going on in RMIT right now that are not only not about sustainability, but arguably even opposite to sustainability. So, you know, don't sort of get overwhelmed. You can bring it down to here and now and just start today.
In the program for this exhibition, Andy Butler in the intro talks about a gap that exists between how we live and the stories we tell ourselves. So as if economic growth forever is possible, as if we have limitless resources to draw from, and the gap between that and the actual reality that we're living among and within and around. And it seems to me what you're suggesting is finding ways of living in better alignment with reality now, rather than waiting for others to do it or trying to work out what's perfect before taking that action.
It's interesting because it's one of the projects I'm interested in is how you bring communities together, and this is the dilemma or problem for me, which is, this is a true story which highlights how fucking hopeless I am, is that my wife and I were arguing on Sunday over who was worse. I'd left the kitchen tap running because I had a plant getting watered, and she always leaves too many lights on. And she goes, look what you're fucking doing, the water's going down the drain. I said, look at that fucking light. Why don't you turn the light off? So yeah, my wife's a deputy dean at the, we've got a few PhDs in the house, and here we are, two people screaming at each other because who was the worst. And it is one of those. See, I'm a great conciliator. But as an anecdote, it is that real challenge about, when I go and talk to people, and sometimes people who have no sense of what climate change is, when you talk to people about what they value and what they want, you actually get generally a lot of consensus. But then about that notion, we talked about again last week, Matt, about, well, what might we change in the short term? What might we give up in the short term for that gain? Even talking to people can fracture really, really quickly. And that's the dilemma that I face when I'm doing this work outside all the time. And I don't tell them that story, by the way.
So Tony's mentioning last week there was an event at the Arts Centre that Tony spoke at and that I was hosting, and it was called Water Futures. And it was an interdisciplinary conversation, bringing in scientists and artists and activists and policymakers and others to talk about the future of water in the Asia-Pacific region. So a lot of similar conversations and topics came up in that. And yeah, Tony's point on the stage on that day was about what we each are willing to give up and let go of in order to move forward. And it's a provocative but beautiful question, I think.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the things for us to think about it, if we took it as a literal translation, it could be problematic, because if you go to my point earlier, well, there are some people with a lot more than others. They have a lot more, so they should take more responsibility and give up. Sometimes it wasn't material. For many Aboriginal communities, it might be not to give up, but to put aside distrust, to put aside for a moment anxiety about dealing with people who you may not have a trustful relationship, and to listen. And the young Indigenous group I'm involved with, Seed Mob, they have some really dynamic young people. A lot of what they know historically in their own families and communities would tell them engaging outside the community is less than helpful and can be really destructive. But they've taken a proactive stance to find and reach out to non-Aboriginal people to begin relationships and see where they go. And some of them regress because people do make the same mistakes as they've always made, but they have developed some really productive ongoing connections with young non-Aboriginal environmental people, and they're doing really great stuff.
Great.
Can I just also say, I should also have emphasised when I was talking that there's a lot of people now looking at positive plus relationships. So just as we've got sort of negative feedbacks, or negative in a normative sense feedbacks going on, there's a real turn to regenerative politics, to things where we can achieve multiple goals at once. So when we give up things, as Tony was just talking about, but if we give up material things as well, it can be a positive thing, it can be a release. And so it's not this sort of sense of self-flagellation or altruism or some kind of, moral asceticism, that there is actually a flourishing that's possible through taking this path as well. It can be a very positive and expansive time.
Taking action and living in ways that are aligned with planetary needs and ecological limits is often seen as a sacrifice and giving up and letting go. I know personally that every move I've made to be more sustainable, for want of a better word, has made me happier and healthier and better connected with community and so on. So the reality doesn't necessarily fit that picture all the time.
Well, and the process can be hard.
Yes.
And, they often talk in climate change about going through a grief process where all the different 5 stages, including guilt, anger, etc., but finally getting to a better place and an acceptance.
So it's grief, guilt, awesome is the final stage.
Sort of. But it's a hard road, yes. But we can get there.
Can I get a show of hands in the room for who would categorise or put themselves in the pigeonhole of artist? Who would say you're an artist in the room? Just to get a sense of the mix in the room. And then other, just to give me a sense of who's not putting their hand up at all. Yeah, good, okay, cool. Any questions from artists or comments in terms of what this means for your practice? It would be useful to hear from you. We've heard from Sarah specifically about her practice and that challenge of bumping up against the desire to make stuff. And in fact, Sarah, you mentioned to me before that you did think about and consider, are there other art forms that I could explore that wouldn't involve material stuff?
Well, I did some performative works and film and video for a while too, but I actually always come back to wanting to make things with my hands. It's just something that's quite innate.
And there's a challenge in that though, right, with what Lauren's saying in terms of like how much stuff do we need, and where do you stop?
Yeah, and so I've developed a way in my practice where I just constantly kind of rework and reuse the same set of materials. I mean, I do add to it a bit, but I'm constantly reworking and adding to what I have.
And also I would say that the concept that the digital is not material is mythical as well. I mean, we just need to look at all of this, which has been mined in virtually
exactly right,
every continent of the planet. And the energy use is one of the major sources of carbon dioxide in the planet. The internet is now becoming a major sector in climate change discussions on its own. So this sort of, you never escape it.
I read that fashion is the second biggest contributor to climate change as a sector after mining and minerals extraction. Is that true? Can anyone confirm that?
Yeah. I've read that too, yeah.
Yeah, that's quite hardcore and makes it very relevant for having this topic, this conversation today. Are there any other questions from the room or comments?
I guess just on what you were saying before, and the idea of like fast fashion, sustainability, being waste-free, et cetera, they're really good concepts, but do you think as a modern society we are making these moves that are like trending and in turn creating like gentrification? Well, like it's a lot of things that are really trending, and like we're wanting to, as a society, be part of these movements, like be better citizens. But in doing that, we create these modern spaces that embody these things, but potentially lose other elements of culture and kind of ironically their own fast fashions. Like, I mean, for instance, neighborhoods around the world, like San Francisco is facing like a huge identity crisis because of gentrification, and all these amazing things that are happening are killing their culture.
Any reflections on that?
Well, I mean, it mightn't seem related initially, but I've written a lot on gentrification because I did my PhD in urban history on Fitzroy, where I grew up. And one of the things I've noticed amongst young people, a new discussion about gentrification, but clearly it's not a new concept. And in the modern phase, it's something that started to occur around 1970 with heritage paint coming to Fitzroy and other suburbs. So it's a relatively old notion. I think there are 2 points though that you're asking really important questions, and that is that, again, going back to the group of people I'm working with today, if they were to come in here, they would say, well, this is how we talk about climate change, I'm out of here, and they would, what can this do? And they'd be sort of feel, again, I think, disconnected. I think it's interesting, there is a way to breach this, and that is that, again, often when you talk to Aboriginal people who will be, might be described as protectors of the environment, will say, well, not environmentalists, I'm just living my life. And I think that you use the word trending, and part of a sort of, whether we're part of fashion or whether it's part of being a hipster or whatever, is that it's to find a way of talking and connecting that can go beyond that. Because in reality, I think that while some people might see it as part of a fad, I do believe that essentially most people, there are values that we ascribe to the way we want to live, and we need to rediscover, we need to connect with those values. So I think it's the language or the way that we discuss and connect up around these issues that needs to be challenged. So I think it was your point again about what does the gallery space mean and who it appeals to. So we're all implicated in that, but there are still things happening in here, and there's still interests in here amongst people that I actually think are interests that that people want to engage with. So when I'm doing writing workshops with these people I work with, I do use a particular language, and that is to say really basic things. Tell me about a place you love. And talking about positive, we get these people to tell me about the place that you love. Tell me about the place, why you love it. And then we say, and tell me about how you would feel if that place was inundated by a dramatic weather event. They get that straight away.
So you don't go into them and say, what do you think about climate change?
No.
You go in and say, tell me about a place that you love,
No,
that you care about.
we discuss climate change at the end.
Yeah.
And this goes back, by the way, to a project Matt and I worked on, a project called Weather Stations, and I work with 15-year-old kids in Europe, and Matt and I were connected with a school here in Melbourne, Footscray City College. I worked with some really poor kids in Dublin, right on the outskirts of town. They didn't have a clue about climate change. They sort of didn't want to know about climate change, and they felt as disempowered as any young people could be. These are kids who didn't have a second pair of trousers and didn't have money to buy lunch. But when I said, well, tell me about a place you loved, and they talked about a paddock down the end of their street where they kept their ponies, or talked about where they ran off to the hills of a night with their girlfriends or boyfriends and smoking and carrying on, they wrote beautifully about those places. Then I said, all right, I showed them some photographs of friends of mine that lost their house at the Black Saturday bushfire. I talked about people who lose houses and to floods in Australia, which are an increasing event. Those kids got that straight away, and they want their places looked after. So I think your point is really important. I just think we're not using... Sometimes we need to break our language down to something really more direct and basic. And the thing that we learned through that project was that there are many ways to talk about climate change, and sometimes you have to talk about it in a very different way depending who you're talking with. And that's not to be cynical. That's to say, what is it a way that I can connect with this person that they will see me as legitimate and authentic? And, you know, imagine that challenge of an artist. You take one of your works into a community of people who never get to see art. I'm not saying that they should say, oh, that's just wank. Yeah, what does that teach me? What I would say is there is a way that you could connect with those people, but how would you find a language that did that?
And I sometimes wonder if the idea of the Anthropocene, that this is an age or an era that we're living through where we're affecting everything around us, and that there might be some humility that might come of that, a little bit more ego, a bit less ego perhaps. I wonder if this Anthropocene idea is an opportunity to get out of some of that jargon and the boxes we put ourselves in. I mean, we've been using Anthropocene and climate change a little bit interchangeably here, which I'm not sure is quite right. I don't know, I'm just asking the question, I suppose. But for me, climate change is one of many symptoms or outcomes of the way that we're living and affecting the planet at the moment. And there's a lot of stuff in the work here that's about electronic waste and the way that it weaves through our culture and into our bodies through waterways and oceans and so on. And that goes beyond climate change. It's all related and linked, of course, but it goes beyond it. So I wonder if there's an opportunity here to broaden things out and perhaps, as Tony's talking about, to let that influence our language and to come back to what's really human and common among us all, that we all have places we love. And none of us want to see those damaged. So it's not about some overarching concept that can sometimes get in the way,
Well,
maybe.
most of us don't want to see that damage.
Yeah, right. There you go. Lauren, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess as a geographer, I'm always thinking across scales, and the places we love, I think, is a really important one. There's a beautiful campaign that's been on that basis, isn't it? Is it ACA?
Australian Conservation Foundation has that.
Been doing,
yeah.
and I think that's a really important way in. What I would also say is that we need to respect places that other people love, and that sometimes is where it becomes a bit more difficult. And one of the kind of things about the Anthropocene, one of the kind of aesthetics is the post-industrial landscapes, the scarred landscapes that we've sort of abandoned because they are no longer beautiful. They're quite ugly to our eye, partly because we have damaged them. You know, I'm thinking here of work I'm doing in the Latrobe Valley, and that the people there feel very unloved. They feel like they are being abandoned, and they're being abandoned by the French energy company that's pulled out, etc., all in the name of sustainability, mind you, because the companies are redirecting away from coal power to renewables, which is a good thing. So, you know, I think we need to have a very inclusive, encompassing sense of the places we love, and we also have to be alert to the political abuse of these notions of local connection and parochialism. So I'm thinking here of some of the attacks on the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Act, which is Australia's main federal piece of legislation, where there's moves to limit who can actually protest a development, even of the size of the largest coal mine in the southern hemisphere, which is what the Adani mine proposed is, unless you live there. Not only if you live there, but you have to demonstrate a really strong connection to the place, usually in the form of private property, which is where gentrification comes in, that to show to the courts you have a proper interest in the area. Well, a lot of us have an interest in that broad area and an interest in the effects on all the other areas that burning all that coal would have. But the law kind of refines it and narrows it down to, well, you have no say, you're not a local, you don't even own property here. So I think we've got to be alert to that, because that's a really exclusionary way of doing things. And so I guess to take the places we love and to understand that that can be multiple for us and not just local, and also multiple in that it takes a lot of different perspectives.
It felt for quite a while that these ideas were out there, but that they weren't being reflected in the artworks, whether in galleries or on music shelves or whatever, but I feel like that's really shifting. It's a great reflection. Tony, how about you? Where to from here in a positive way?
I think in regard to art generally, I mean, at a very personal level, I invariably, if I look at work, I get really inspired, and I get inspired to think, I get inspired to write, and I get inspired to act. So I've actually always really enjoyed engaging with artists, and I actually see it as really important. And I want to make a point, I don't come from an artistic family. Art in our family was a very weird concept, which I won't go into here. I don't want to scare people. But, you know, when I was a teenage boy, we went to the National Gallery when it just opened down at St Kilda Road. And it might be a bit kitschy now or out of fashion, but I was about 13 years old, and I've just got a short story coming out on this now. I went into the Great Hall, and, yeah, that Leonard French ceiling. I still remember as a kid thinking, why would someone do this? It was so magical, and you know. And even when I go there now, and I see little kids traipsing around, and I think that connection has never ended between that and the height of that. And that didn't get me politically thinking, but I thought it's got me thinking about someone's generosity in doing that and thinking. So I think art really matters, and I take the point about who it matters to. But yeah, when I taught creative writing at Melbourne, my honours class, about week 4, I'd always take them down to the Potter Gallery, and we have a little contest where I'd say, okay, you've got to go into the gallery, you start at the top. I'm very OCD, so people have to do things the way I tell them. You start at the top, you come around, and when you come out, we're going to have a coffee, and I want you to argue for your piece of art. And we would do that, and then they'd say, oh, do we have to write about this? I say, no. Nah. I say, well, we have to. I say, don't do anything. Over the next couple of weeks, the creative output of my writing students was the greatest it ever was during the semester, because I believe that creative relationship, it stimulates them. So I think artists matter a lot in that way. And in regard to the other question about the Anthropocene, again, thinking personally, and we talked about this before I started doing this work, I got into a really morose state and really sort of almost depressed about where we were going and feeling quite powerless. And I'm an academic, I'm a writer, I can talk to people. I started to think it's a waste of time. And a friend of mine, he said, it's fucking over. It's over. And I thought, what do you mean it's over? I haven't had that since I was at Sacred Heart Primary School. And when I started doing this work, and you meet people every day who are doing really good stuff, I actually think, well, I don't know if I feel optimistic, but I just think, well, at least I'm involved with a group of people who are going to go down fighting. So my sense around this whole debate is, as long as it generates more discussion and more work, it's all you can do. Yeah, you can't say, well, it's not, we're going to, I don't project into the future. I just think this is what I'm doing now, and I'm doing it with this group of people today, and tomorrow I'm going to be doing it with some other people, and that's all I can do.
Yeah, great. It's sort of optimism through action. And then Lauren, something to close from you, if we could.
Well, I mean, I would encourage everyone here to do exactly what you are demonstrating by being here today, which is being part of the conversation and staying informed and thinking and working on this. And one of the most important things everyone needs to do is just bear witness and just start calling things out, and call things out in our own work and practice, but call things out around us and think about your own practice at multiple levels. So there's the concepts that you're putting out and the communication role that you're having and the cultural norms that you're helping to shift. there's the materiality of what you're doing, and that can't be separated, and thinking about that and thinking about all those other elements and thinking about the broader creative industries, art world that you're part of and how it's threatened. You think of the floods in Paris in 2015. The Louvre was at threat of being flooded. So these great cultural artefacts are at threat as well. So there's all sorts of levels at which you can apply this, and I just encourage you all to see the Anthropocene as the green light. This is the moment. The great acceleration's been coming. Whether you want to see 400,000 years or 10,000 years, we've all been waiting, I think, waiting for when we have to change, and the moment's now.
So if you're waiting for permission, you just got it. Apparently, that's great.
Start with RMIT.
Start here at home. Awesome. Thank you so much to our wonderful panellists. Please give them a round of applause for their contributions today. I'd like to also acknowledge the wonderful work of the artists in the exhibition here and the co-curators of the exhibition, Andy Butler, John Brooks and Josephine Briggenshaw. And also like to acknowledge Asha B. Abrahams, producer of this event and other events around this. Please give those four a wonderful round of applause as well.